What are the three principles of prenatal development? The first one is proximodistal. If you think of the word proximity, proximity meaning nearby, distal meaning far away. So it literally means near to far. And we're going to find out later in development, muscular development, once the baby is born, that these things also apply. But for now, when we're talking about prenatal development, this means that things in the middle develop before the outer part. So the inner organs, the organs of the trunk, develop before the arm buds start to develop into arms and hands and fingers. Cephalocaudal means head to tail. So the top parts of the prenatal baby also develop before the bottom. The head gets bigger before the arms and legs start coming out. The arms come before the legs do. And so everything at the top starts developing before the things at the bottom do. Finally, the last one is mass to specific. So larger things are going to be developed before more finer details. So you develop arms, then hands, then fingers, and then lastly fingernails and creases. Often when babies are born prematurely, they are born with, baby boys can be born with a scrotum that has no wrinkles. One of my children was born prematurely and he was born like this. And eventually this develops. So you see the scrotum developed first and then the wrinkles and creases came in next. So these are what the three principles are: near to far, head to tail, and then larger to smaller. Thalidomide and rubella. These were really scary things when they happened. In other countries, thalidomide was given to reduce morning sickness, and therefore many children were born without arms or legs during this era. This led to massive, massive changes in our Federal Drug Administration, and now it takes a really long time for drugs to be approved. And this is really because of the thalidomide epidemic. This is what made the FDA much more difficult to get drugs through. So, for instance, my son has celiac disease, and they're testing drugs right now to help people who cannot metabolize gluten. However, it could be 10 years before he's able to get a hold of one. And so he'll have to eat gluten-free for a long time still. The rubella epidemic, the German measles, which you've all been inoculated from or had vaccines for as infants, usually they're given in the first year of life, 15 months, I believe, we had a huge epidemic of this in the 1960s when I was born. And during this time, lots of pregnant women contracted rubella or German measles. And their children were born with heart defects, vision and hearing defects, and mental impairments, developmental disabilities. And these kids were all born with really severe disabilities. At this time, there's this huge population of people who are now in their 50s and 60s who are deafblind because of the rubella epidemic at the time. At the time, since there were so many children, a lot of governments put a lot of money into deafblind education, and the US is no different. And since then, there is a line item in the federal education law just for deafblindness. Even though rubella syndrome is not really around anymore because everybody's been vaccinated against it, there are other reasons for deafblindness, including something called CHARGE syndrome, which is the #1 genetic reason. This is something that my son has, my other son. I have 3 kids, you'll find out. My other son has CHARGE syndrome, and he is deaf and legally blind and has developmental delays and balance problems and all kinds of things. But he has actually had great benefit because of the rubella epidemic, because at that time they learned how best to teach people who were deafblind to communicate and do all kinds of things. And so when he came around and was born, this was all in place and ready to go for his education. When I ask this question, why it's hard to evaluate exposures during pregnancy, why can't we figure out, for instance, when is it that alcohol causes damage to the fetus or the embryo? We can't do this because you cannot set up an experiment to test this. It's just like the random assignment question from before. You cannot cause people harm. And so you can't do an experiment and have random assignment where you have half of the women drink alcohol during their pregnancy and the other half not. It's just not ethical. You can't cause harm. So it's kind of a big guess when we try to figure out when alcohol causes damage. We know that alcohol is a teratogen and causes damage probably for the most part during the sensitive period. However, the critical period, I mean. However, we don't know for sure that it doesn't cause damage earlier or later than that as well. So we can't really test that. So basically, we tell people don't smoke, don't drink, don't contract rubella or anything like that, because we can't experiment to exactly find out. And that's the safest way to go through your pregnancy, just avoiding these things altogether. Now that you know the difference between chromosomes and genes, a chromosomal disorder has to do with a whole chromosome being the problem. For instance, trisomy 21, meaning there are three 21st chromosomes, trisomy, is Down syndrome. And that means that people with Down syndrome are born with three copies of the 21st chromosome. And this is what causes all of their genetic differences. There are other kinds of chromosome problems. You can have half a chromosome missing. You can have a piece of a tail of a chromosome missing. There are other trisomy disorders like trisomy 13 and trisomy 18, where we have three 18th or 13th chromosomes. These are both devastating to the person and cause them to have severe disabilities and not be able to live very long lives. So there are lots of different chromosome disorders that people can have. So we know what a chromosome disorder is. What is a single gene disorder? Each chromosome, as you saw before, has many genes. There are lots of ways to pass on your genes. Dominant, recessive, and sex-linked manners are the ways to do this. For instance, we all know that some genes are dominant over others. Brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes. And so if your father has brown eyes and your mother has blue eyes, and they each pass along that gene, you're going to have brown eyes. Okay? So if you've studied any genetics at all, you know that two dominant genes make a dominant. One dominant and one recessive gene will make the dominant phenotype come out. Two recessive genes, however, together without a dominant gene, will make the phenotype of the recessive gene come out. So if you have two parents who both have blue eyes and they each contribute a blue eye gene to you, you're going to have blue eyes. Okay, so Huntington's disease is a dominant transmission disease. The Huntington's disease is dominant over the normal gene. So if your father passes along the Huntington's gene to you and your mother doesn't, your mother passes along the normal gene to you, you will get Huntington's disease. The problem with Huntington's disease is that you don't realize you have it until after the childbirth years. So you don't have any symptoms of the disease until after Huntington's disease comes along. So you've already given birth to all your children and passed along the gene. This is why it's called the ticking time bomb. Recessive gene disorders. Sickle cell anemia is an example. So sickle cell anemia happened in Africa. We think it evolved there because of the malaria, high incidence of malaria in Africa. So when people had malaria and were dying from it, their bodies over time developed these sickle cell genes. If you have a dominant normal gene from one parent and a sickle cell gene from another parent, it protects you from malaria. And these people have evolved to be protected from malaria. So having the sickle cell anemia gene is a good thing. However, if you happen to get born with two sickle cell anemia genes, one from each parent, two recessive genes, then you're going to have this devastating disorder. So that's recessive transmission. Sex-linked transition, also called X-linked. This is an interesting one. This is when the mother has a recessive gene for a disorder in the X chromosome, okay? And the father has a normal X chromosome that he passes on to his little girl. So when you have the recessive and the dominant together, recessive from the mother, the dominant from the father's X dominates the mother's recessive, and therefore the child is born normal. However, if the child is a boy and the mother contributes the X chromosome with the recessive gene, and the father contributes a Y chromosome, making it a boy, there is no normal gene on the father's gene to mask the mother's recessive gene, because the Y chromosome is much shorter and has a lot fewer genes and less information on it. So in that case, little boys will be born with something like hemophilia or some kind of sex-linked chromosomal disorder. So in other words, girls are much better protected. Boys are the only ones typically who get sex-linked or X-linked disorders. Another one is color blindness. Color blindness happens in boys for the most part. There are some girls with some odd types of color blindness, but the most common types are male disorders, and that's because it's a sex-linked chromosome. So, ladies, although your mother may have carried a color blindness gene from her father, you will not get it because your father gave you a normal X chromosome. And men, if your mother had carried the color blindness gene along, although she did not have color blindness, and carried it along from her father, and your father gave you a color blindness gene and your father gave you the Y chromosome, you are more likely to be colorblind. So if any of you are colorblind, it would be interesting to figure out how this came about for you. One reason that we believe that infant mortality is much greater in the United States than in other developed countries, I mean, look at this chart. The United States has the most infant mortality except for Cuba, is because we don't have universal health care here in the United States. And so there are a lot of people who choose not to or cannot afford to have health care. And therefore they don't get prenatal care when they're pregnant. They aren't taking prenatal vitamins. They're not getting checkups and anything like that. And by the same token, once their babies are born, their babies aren't getting what they need in terms of infant care medically. So the question I put on your prep guide about why has this possibly going to change with the current administration is because the Affordable Health Care Act now requires that everyone, even if you have low income, have some sort of health care. So hopefully, although this is not universal health care, it will make a change in the infant mortality rates in the United States. If you're not familiar with the Affordable Care Act, we call it also, some people call it Obamacare. Essentially, there was a lot of infant mortality before we knew what germs were. When germs were finally seen under a microscope and people finally understood that germs could be transmitted to one another, things changed a lot in healthcare. But in the 18th century, when women were pregnant and were having babies and going through childbirth, doctors they weren't allowed to look at what they were doing. So they'd reach up under the skirts of a woman or under a nightgown of a woman and not be able to look, just do things by feel. And this caused a lot of problems with natural childbirth, with people giving birth. If women would have been left alone with midwives the way it had always been before doctors started taking over, there might not have been so many problems. I already talked about no awareness of germs or sterility. Um, these doctors would often just go from one patient to another without washing their hands. It's an interesting difficulty that people had with medicine back in the day. People didn't understand about sterilization. And so they would often these doctors would spread diseases from one patient to another. So they'd go see a patient who had the influenza or go see a patient who had, uh, whooping cough or something, and then deliver a baby the same day without washing their hands. And the mother and the baby would die. And so some people believe that it would have been better if doctors had stayed out of it and it had stayed a family or a midwifery kind of thing. And even now we're moving more and more toward natural childbirth. People are getting midwives in their homes. And so we seem to be swinging back the other direction. That's not to say that medicine now doesn't do a good job. They do. Even if you have a nurse midwife working with you when you are having a baby, it's good to be near a hospital so that if there is a complication of some kind, that you can get some medical attention for it.